campaigning is winding down on the eve of elections, seen as a battle for Britain's soul. Around this time tomorrow, Brits will be heading to the polls. This follows weeks of door-knocking for campaigners to sway voters. Let's get an update now on the last day of garnering votes. So we cross live to our UK correspondent Holly Hudson, who's in London. Holly, very good morning to you. I guess the race is definitely on to Downing Street. Where are the candidates focusing on, Holly, on the eve of this all-important elections? Which are some of the constituencies that could decide this election?
Yes, very much so. There's all to play for here. We've recently had a poll that is potentially one of the most accurate in terms of the fact that it predicted the hung parliament in the last election. That was released overnight, and it shows that the lead that Boris Johnson currently seems to hold is narrowing. So very nervous in the Conservative Party HQ this morning as the race is tightening. It's all to play for still here in the UK. So Boris Johnson out in those constituencies, as you say, that are the opposition party, usually held by the opposition party Labour, but that voted Leave. Because of course, Boris Johnson called this election, the reason he says he wants to go back to the country is so he can secure a majority in the House of Commons. He currently doesn't have that all-important number of 326 seats that would make it easy for him to slide through his deal, his withdrawal agreement that he agreed with the EU, and essentially get Brexit done. That much repeated message that we've heard here in the UK that has been canvassed by Conservative Party candidates on the doorsteps that Boris Johnson has been repeating throughout the campaign, that if you vote for him to get the keys to number 10 once again, then he will get Brexit done by the current deadline of January 31st. Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the main opposition party, has been trying to frame this election on anything but Brexit, trying to focus on issues such as austerity and the National Health Service. And Boris Johnson has suffered one of potentially his most catastrophic setbacks this week in relation to the NHS here, which is of course a beloved institution, in that he was confronted with a picture of a 4-year-old lying on coats on the floor of a hospital up north in Leeds, and his reaction to that he was much criticised for. And that also we've heard that the NHS is now almost on a par with Brexit in terms of the minds of voters. So that does actually go in Jeremy Corbyn's favour and the Labour Party in comparison to the Conservatives. So while there is still a lead for Boris Johnson, polls do still predict he might get a majority. Very much the race is tightening, so all to play for.
All to play for indeed. Boris Johnson on the campaign trail and promising to deliver Brexit. I came across some interesting news, Holly. The father of the London Bridge stab victim, Jack Merritt, is making headlines, I see. Reportedly, Jack's father said Boris Johnson was seeing this tragedy as an opportunity to score some points in the election. Johnson apparently was talking about prison sentences. Has he reacted in any way to this criticism? What's been the political reaction with regards to this?
Yes, there's been a row here in the UK over politicians' reactions to the London Bridge terror attack, which of course took place a couple of weeks ago and which resulted in the deaths of 2 young people, Jack Merritt being one of them. He was working in at a prison rehabilitation conference at Fishmongers Hall near London Bridge when he was fatally stabbed that day. Now, his father has spoken out several times and urged politicians not to use this to encourage their own campaigns, use it as a sort of political football, shall we say. And he's once again spoken out and said that if Jack Merritt were alive, he would say that he wouldn't want Boris Johnson to use this to encourage tougher sentences in any way, of course, because that goes against what Jack Merritt was working for, prison rehabilitation. of victims. So it's very much become a hot potato here in terms of how politicians have reacted to Jack Merritt's death, and Jack Merritt's father criticising Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson saying that obviously giving his condolences to the family, but again urging tougher sentences against terrorists, something that Jack Merritt's father says wouldn't have been what Jack Merritt would have wanted.
Look, no doubt these elections have a lot to do with Johnson's Conservatives hoping to secure a ruling majority to, I guess, break this Brexit logjam. On the other side, there's been some would call it cringe-worthy moments for the Labour Party. Reportedly, their shadow health secretary was caught on tape saying voters cannot stand Jeremy Corbyn. Oops. How is that going down?
Yes, exactly. This week, it started off with Boris Johnson suffering a setback in terms of his reaction, as I mentioned earlier, to the photo of the 4-year-old boy on the floor of a hospital in Leeds. He put the phone in his pocket and tried then brought it back out of his pocket and reacted to the picture. But he was very much criticised over his reaction to that. And as I said, the NHS, of course, is something that Labour have been trying to push. They say they will save the NHS if they are to come to power. Boris Johnson always trying to keep the focus on Brexit. So any sort of win for the NHS is essentially a bit of a win for Labour. So Labour were looking at a pretty good point at the beginning of this week. But then, as you say, their Shadow Health Secretary, John Ashworth, overheard and recorded speaking to a Conservative friend talking about the state of Labour in outside of urban areas as dire. So that recording Jeremy Corbyn has brushed off as just a bit of banter between friends, but both parties in many ways suffering setbacks this week. And of course, across the 5 weeks of campaigning, the two main parties as well have suffered setbacks that really could, we don't know as yet how they will affect this election. Of course, Labour fighting off claims of anti-Semitism. The chief rabbi here very much criticising Labour earlier on in the campaign. Boris Johnson too has faced severe criticism for ducking big interviews and big debates on television. So, of course, again, this is as well a Christmas election. 2 weeks before Christmas, people are going out to the polls, to the ballot box tomorrow. How is that going to affect turnout as well?
Yeah, look, this, I understand, is the first winter election in nearly a century. Is the weather going to have any bearing on the elections?
Well, it doesn't look too good, which isn't much of a surprise here in the UK around this time of year. And you do speak to voters here who do say, of course, that they just want to be buying their Christmas presents. They don't want to be having to think about another election. This is the third in 4 years, and we could be electing our fourth Prime Minister in 4 years. So Boris Johnson might not get the keys back to number 10. There might be a new Prime Minister in Downing Street by this time in 48 hours.
Let's just talk about if he does win. You know, what are analysts saying? When you look at the candidates and what are some of the likely international consequences? What, for instance, would a Boris Johnson win mean for a country like South Africa?
Well, for South Africa, there are options in terms of trade, of course, because what would happen now if Boris Johnson wins this magic 326 seats, 326 seats is what he's after. He currently had, the Conservatives in the last election won 318, so they didn't get a majority in government. If Boris Johnson gets that, he will be able to, as he puts it, slide his oven-ready Brexit deal through Parliament, his withdrawal agreement, and get Brexit done by the 31st of January. But the reality is then that Britain will enter what's called a transition period. And during that time, they have to agree a trade relationship with the EU. Of course, the EU is Britain's biggest trading partner, so that is going to be no small feat. The UK is completely enmeshed with the EU, and if you speak to analysts here, they say that Boris Johnson and the UK government would have to work at breakneck speed to agree some kind of trade deal in that time, because there is a deadline of December 31st, 2020, by which they should have agreed this trade deal at the moment. Of course, we have to remember that Britain should have left the EU in March earlier this year. So December 31st, 2020, at one point did seem like a reasonable deadline, but given the fact that the UK still hasn't left the European Union, that now seems far out of reach, particularly if you speak to analysts here. They say it's very unrealistic, but Boris Johnson and the Conservatives have made it a manifesto pledge to hit that December 31st deadline. So if they don't, that would mean that the UK could still leave the European Union on World Trade Organization rules, which is essentially no deal. So no deal still on the cards here if you speak to analysts. And do bear in mind, of course, that it took Canada 7 years or more to agree a similar trade deal with the European Union, and they're no way, in any way, as closely tied as the UK is. But on the flip side of that, there is also the opportunity for the UK to agree trade deals with other countries. Of course, we've already heard murmurings of the UK making sort of preliminary or having preliminary talks with the US. In terms of trade talks, that has caused a lot of friction, a lot of controversy here in the UK in terms of whether the NHS would be on the table in those trade talks. But of course, there is scope for other countries as well. So we may well see the Foreign Secretary, whoever that is, next year jetting off around the world to have those preliminary talks, including potentially with South Africa.
You know, you're talking about the flip side, Holly, before I let you go. What would his loss, Johnson's loss, signify?
So if Boris Johnson lost, then there is potential that we could again, there's sort of two options really. We may well see a hung Parliament. There is still, according to the pollsters, very much a possibility of what's known as a hung Parliament, which is again what we saw really with Theresa May's victory in 2017, whereby they don't get this majority of seats in the House of Commons, and that, as a result of that, whoever the winning party might be, say it is the Conservatives, would have to join forces or lean on essentially another party in government in order to pass any laws. That's what Theresa May did with the Democratic Unionist Party, or the DUP, back in 2017. There is also, of course, the option of a coalition, which is what David Cameron did back in 2010 with the Liberal Democrat leader Nick Clegg. But several of the parties have ruled out doing that with the Conservatives, so it'd be interesting to see what happens there. There is still, of course, the option of a second referendum, because if Labour get to power, that is what they say they'll do. They'll renegotiate the Brexit deal in 3 months and put it back to the people. So no deal, second referendum, or Brexit could be done by the 31st of January, but certainly not dusted at all.
Well, it's all to play for, I guess. Holly Hudson, we'll be touching base with you in the next couple of days. Thank you very much indeed for your reporting. UK Correspondent Holly Hudson, live for us in London.